Hello class, this is Case Study 2 Part 1. The title of this case study is Shrimp, There's Something Fishy Going On. For this next case study, we are leaving the San Francisco Bay and heading out to sea. Specifically, we will be looking at ocean health and using shrimp as a case study to better understand aquatic ecosystems. We're going to look at food webs, ecological interactions, species interactions, and many other components that affect ocean health. So the question is, should we purchase wild or farmed shrimp? Let's say that you and your friend are at the store picking out a shrimp platter for a party at Costco or somewhere else like that. Your friend wants to go with the wild-caught shrimp platter, while you think farmed shrimp is a more environmentally sound choice. Questions you might ask yourself is, which of these is more sustainable? And how much money would we be willing to spend on that choice? So take a moment to consider this. Which one do you think, before we even begin presenting research, which one do you think is more sustainable, farmed or wild shrimp? So we've talked a lot about mercury in our last case study. We said that there is a lot of mercury in the bay, but also a lot of the mercury contaminated sediment is finally starting to wash out of the bay from the last 50 years or so. Also, there's a lot of remediation and cleanup that is taking place in the bay as well. Now, guidelines indicate that some fish in the bay is safe to eat in moderation. There are some fish that are also going to be high in mercury. Those are those bigger fish that get that mercury in their bodies through the biomagnification process. However, we need to think about this bioaccumulation question now in the context of farmed versus wild fish. But first, before we jump into figuring out how to answer this question, we need to learn some fundamentals about biodiversity, because harvesting shrimp negatively can impact our global ocean health. First, let's focus on biodiversity, which is to say, what does it mean? What does it mean for the environment? And what does it mean in the context of our shrimp case study? Well, biodiversity is defined as the number of different organisms and their relative frequency. And this relative frequency part is key, because depending on the numbers of organisms in relation to others, that can drastically affect the biodiversity for a given biome. Now, the term encompasses different ecosystems, species, and or genes, as well as their relative abundance. So we can think about biodiversity in the context of genetics. So take a look at this figure. It shows us two different communities of different organisms. And I would ask you to say which one has the highest biodiversity, as well as why. Well, if we look at Group A, we see some spiders, some amoeba, some trees, some foxes, some bears, and some mushrooms. Group A has 22 individuals overall. Group B has a similar group of organisms, but only 12 individuals. So therefore, Group A is larger, but numbers alone don't really translate into biodiversity. Now, Group A and Group B both have 6 different species. However, we wouldn't say that this is an even number for diversity. Let's go back to the definition. A number of different organisms and their relative frequency among those different species. So though community A has more individuals, the relative frequency is off. Group A is dominated by spiders, whereas in community B, each species has a higher proportion of the total. That makes sense, right? Think about diversity as we think about it in terms of gender or race. If we had a room full of women with one guy, that's not a very diverse room. Whereas if we had a room that was fairly evenly divided between men and women, that would be more diverse. We could also ask, how many species are there in the world? Well, over 1.5 million species have been named on our planet, but we believe the total number could be 3 million or even more. New species are discovered every single year on our planet, even today. This table and figure shows us some different types of life forms and their estimated numbers on our planet. And the main thing to get out of this is not to memorize any numbers, but just to recognize that most of the species on Earth are insects or plants. There are also many species of fungus or protists, which are types of microorganisms, but notice that there are relatively few mammals. And of course, mammals is the group that humans belong to. We don't make up most of the life that is found on our planet. So we know what biodiversity is, and we can probably also figure out what the destruction of biodiversity looks like. There's many places on our planet where forests are being cut down or species are dying because of global climate change. So we really need to figure out why it is we care about biodiversity. How can we justify preserving biodiversity to both ourselves, our friends, and our family members? Well, biodiversity does have benefits. Now, some of these benefits directly benefit humans. For example, around half of all of the drugs on the market in the United States are derived from plants, animals, or microbial organisms. So if we lose that biodiversity in the world, we could lose access to a lot of our drugs. Now, biodiversity also benefits nature because biodiversity boosts ecosystem productivity, where each species, no matter how small, all have an important role to play. And then there's also lots of examples where biodiversity truly benefits both humans and nature. And we're going to look at a great example where it benefits both later in this lecture. Species depend on each other. This is why biodiversity is important for nature. We would consider this a nature-centric reason where organisms need to exist for the benefit of other organisms in a system. For example, the global nitrogen cycle is that relationship of nitrogen between animals and plants and decomposers, and it is key to a healthy functioning planet. Biodiversity is also important to humans, and the fancy word for this is anthropocentric reasons. These anthropocentric reasons are things such as ecosystem services. Biodiversity benefits humans by providing these ecosystem services. For example, protection of our water resources, by breaking down pollution, and by recovering from unpredictable events such as tsunamis or hurricanes. Biodiversity also is a biological resource for humans. Things such as food and medicine are much more easy to get when biodiversity levels are high. And lastly, there are societal benefits. Humans benefit from recreation and tourism, and it's also important to mention cultural values. So many cultures around the world, including cultures in the United States, rely on these plant and animal communities. So here's a thought question for you as you prepare for your exam. Should we put a value on ecosystem services and goods? I want you to try to define what you think is meant by the term ecosystem services. And I want you to think about if we should put a fiscal value on these ecosystem goods and services as well. Here's one example of an ecosystem service that is really important to humans. Here is a fun fact. 1 out of every 3 bites of food an average American eats is directly attributed to honeybee pollination. Honeybees are so important to our ecosystem. They pollinate more than 100 crops, including fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. If the honeybees went away, it would be almost impossible to pollinate our crops. In fact, we estimate that honeybees are responsible for $15 billion in United States agricultural crops every single year. Sadly, global honeybee colonies have been in decline in recent years, and this does pose a serious risk to our natural food supply. Why are bees in decline? Well, it's largely due to habitat loss and also due to chemical exposure. The chemicals that conventional agriculture uses may actually be poisoning some of these honeybee colonies. So biodiversity has many values, both anthropocentric and nature-centric, and we must consider both whenever we study a given ecosystem. We now face what many ecologists are causing a biodiversity crisis. Humans are directly disturbing the environment, which ultimately reduces diversity. For example, deforestation is a very easy example to visualize. When we cut down these trees, it is going to cause a loss of habitat. However, another thing we often don't think about is forest fires. Now, there's been some catastrophic forest fires in California in recent years that have completely devastated many human populations. But forest fires are actually an important part of the natural balance, where small fires go through ecosystems and thin out some parts of the forest. However, when humans stop these small fires from happening, after many, many generations, we can have these catastrophic fires, which is a bad thing. It's this delicate balance of maintaining biodiversity and also managing the land in ways that can help both humans and the environment. So now we can launch into the state of the oceans and really talk about the impacts of shrimp farming on our planet. Again, we're going to compare farmed versus wild-caught shrimp, and we're going to start with a discussion on farmed shrimp. Is it environmentally sustainable? Well, let's give a working definition of sustainability. We're going to deal with this a lot over the course of this semester, and one definition from the Brundtland Commission is, quote, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability to meet the needs of future generations, end quote. This is going to be the definition of sustainability that connects the natural environment to healthy communities and economic vitality. Now, around the world, ecologists have been noticing that there has been a global decline in many fish and shrimp populations. This is largely due to over-harvesting. As we increase the number of boats to feed growing human populations, as well as improve technology to catch these fish, we start to see this global collapse. Some people refer to this as the tragedy of the commons. Now, international waters are typically not governed by any single government, so therefore everyone can have a free-for-all, fishing as much as they want, only governed by international treaties, and this is very hard to enforce. So therefore, this dilemma is that we all share a limited resource, but some fishing operations do not abide by this global need to protect our harvest, and so they only fulfill their corporate self-interest. So if the global ocean populations are in decline, it would make sense that we might want to start to shrimp or fish farming. And whenever we do fish and shrimp farming, it is referred to as aquaculture. Now, about 75% of farmed shrimp is produced in Asia, and in particular in China and Thailand. The other 25% comes mainly from Latin America, where Brazil is the largest producer. One of the places where shrimp harvesting is most impacted is in our global mangrove forests, which are found in these places in China and Southeast Asia, and also Central and South America. Now, these mangrove forests are incredibly biodiverse. They provide very important habitat and breeding grounds for different organisms. They buffer the coastline from tsunami, which is really important for not only animals and plants, but also humans. And because they have such a huge biomass, they also sequester a lot of carbon dioxide and also filter the water. But these mangrove forests are often clear-cut, and they remove those in order to set up shrimp and fish ponds, which are types of farms. By some estimates, over 38% of mangrove forests have been lost due to shrimp farming alone in the last 40 years. One of the biggest problems with mangroves disappearing is a loss of species. Many different species disappear when these mangroves are eliminated. We often think of this as an international problem, right? I mentioned Thailand and Brazil, very far from the United States, but this is a local problem as well. In the United States, specifically in Florida, we start to see a loss of species that live in these mangroves, and many of them are federally listed as endangered species. Well, why is losing species from an ecosystem a big deal in the first place? Well, number one is we have a loss of genetic diversity within these species. If we have less species, we have fewer genes. And if we have fewer genes, we have less available recombination of these genes, which ultimately leads to less possible evolution. Another way to say this is when a disturbance hits, all members of a species, if genetically very close, will respond in the same way. If you've got the same genes, then you probably have the same physiological response. And if you have less available recombination of genes and less genetic diversity, you might not be able to recover after a major natural disturbance. Number two, we have a loss of interactions. When one trophic level in a food web is disturbed, this disturbance can trickle down to the entire food web. Remember, the trophic level of an organism is the position it occupies on the food chain. Interactions are not only between biotic factors. It can also be between biotic factors and abiotic factors. For example, fiddler crabs are essential for cycling nutrients through a mangrove. Their burrows in the mud and the sand bring oxygen into the depleted soils of the mangrove forest. If we lose the mangrove, we lose these key interactions. And number three is loss of ecosystem services when the mangroves are removed. Mangroves protect the coastlines by providing a buffer from hurricanes and tidal waves. The mangrove's massive root system is very efficient at dissipating that wave energy. In addition, they filter pollution and sediment mostly through absorption. They also provide nutrient-rich debris for commercially important species to flourish. Here's a practice question. Consider this statement. Mangrove forests provide many ecosystem services. Would you agree or disagree, and why? Make sure that you provide evidence to back up your opinion. I like to give you these practice questions to keep you in preparation for our exam. So I hope you now understand that losing mangrove forests is a really big deal. Aquaculture can be set up in areas other than mangroves. Sometimes these aquaculture ponds are set up more inland, for example, but even then, there can be problems. For example, these aquaculture operations contain farmed fish or shrimp that can escape the pens that they live in. Sometimes they can actually breed with or outcompete the wild or native species. Now, these aquaculture operations often produce tons of waste, and this waste sometimes collects on ocean bottoms, damaging or eliminating the bottom-dwelling life. This waste can also decrease dissolved oxygen levels in the water as well. Finally, lots of different chemicals are added to these farms. Usually they put in big buckets of antibiotics to try to keep the fish healthy, and those antibiotics enter into our water supply where they can harm people and other life. Another sad fact is that these shrimp farms are often abandoned after only 5 to 10 years. And what do they leave behind? They leave behind a toxic sludge. To grow as many shrimp as possible and maintain overcrowded populations, large amounts of artificial feed and chemical additives are added. And these toxic pesticides can actually get stuck in the mud where they are left behind for many generations to deal with. Now, some of these chemicals that get left behind in the sludge are referred to as persistent organic pollutants, which are abbreviated as POPs. Now, these have the potential to cause developmental and reproductive abnormalities in different types of animals, including humans. It includes a wide variety of chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, phthalates, and PCBs. And we're going to talk more about these when we get into our next case study on food production. Now, from a nutritional standpoint, you might be thinking, is farmed versus wild better for you? In some cases, they're basically the same. But in other cases, the farmed are actually less healthy. And that's because these farmed species are fed huge amounts of things such as corn, which is loaded with omega-6. And this omega-6 fatty acid actually lowers the amount of the healthy omega-3 fatty acids that are found in the fish. So it kind of raises questions about the health benefits of consuming these fish. On the other hand, you might argue that eating these wild fish, especially if they are top predators, due to bioaccumulation, they might be loaded with mercury. So then they're not healthy to eat either. So it really depends on the fish. But it's important because this seafood that we're talking about makes up 16% of our world's protein source. That is really important for many human populations around the world. Our final thought question for this lecture is as follows. Farming shrimp is a mostly sustainable practice. Would you agree or disagree? And in your response, be sure to define what sustainability is and provide specific evidence and examples about sustainable versus unsustainable practices in fish farming. All right, well, that completes our first part of Case Study 2. Thank you very much for listening, and please email me with any questions.